Okay, so vector graphics, basically what you're doing right now in Illustrator. But in order for you to fully understand vector graphics, we also need to learn the difference between vector and raster graphics, which raster you've done before already. But we're going to go ahead and go into a little bit more detail on that. Now, that's basically what I just said. Yeah. Now, vector and raster graphics, they're both good in their own way. Not one is better than the other per se. They both have their strengths and weaknesses, and they're better in different areas. Now, for raster graphics in particular, we'll start with that one first. Now, raster graphics are images that are basically constructed on a grid of pixels. You pretty much already know this. You'll notice whenever you make something like in Photoshop, you're going to start a new drawing. It always asks you first how many pixels wide and how many pixels long you want your canvas to be, because it's basically asking you how big do you want your grid of, how many pixels do you want in your grid basically, and whatever you make is going to be on that grid specifically. Now, due to raster graphics being made on a grid of pixels, they have a lot of versatility. You can modify them. You can modify every individual pixel, so you can make a whole bunch of different detailed, complex images. I mean, raster graphics really has no limitations when it comes to that. They're pretty great. Now, because of that, however, that also creates a weakness. Due to them being made on a specifically sized grid of pixels, that means that if you were to try and change the size, if you were to enlarge it, it would become blurry, because it basically has to stretch those pixels to cover more ground. So usually raster graphics are not the best solution if you're going to be going for something like logo stuff. If you're going to be making different advertisements to put on completely different sized things like billboards or small little business cards. But raster graphics are better if you're going to be making like drawings or illustrations. Now, another example, photographs. Any photographs that you take like with a digital camera, those are also raster graphics, which is also why when you're taking a picture with like a camera, it's always asking you what resolution do you want your camera shot to be, because it's basically asking you how many pixels you want it to be. Now, vector graphics are basically the opposite. They do better when it comes to sizing them up, to any different size. They do better with that. And the reason for that is because vector graphics are not made on a grid of pixels. Rather, they are made on a graph that you plot points onto, and the computer draws a line between every little dot. Now, these dots are called anchor points, and the lines are called paths. Now, it's basically the same concept as like you're in your math class and you're solving a math problem to figure out where you want to put a dot on your graph, and then you draw a line between them. It's the exact same concept. The computer uses geometrical equations to figure out where dots are going to be put on a graph and how the lines should be connected between them. Now, because it's done like that, every time you size up the image in a different resolution, the computer basically redraws it again, because it remembers, oh, the equation said to plot a point here and draw a line here and here. So it will basically remap it every time you bring it into a different size. So because of that, it never loses quality whenever you enlarge it. Did I say everything? Now, vector graphics do have their own weakness as well. Like I said earlier, they're basically a polar opposite to raster graphics. Now, because everything that you make in vector, because everything is made out of anchor points, that basically limits how detailed and complex the image will be. When you add color to a vector graphics, it's done by either filling in a color within the path that you drew or around it, which is called stroking. So it's very limited on how you can apply color to it. And you'll notice if you try to take a raster graphic and you try to convert it into a vector graphic, you'll notice that there will be some inevitable loss in color quality. And these two pictures I showed right here, it's pretty obvious. Now, like I said earlier, raster graphics and vector graphics do have their own uses in different places. So raster graphics is basically better for digital publication of images. Pretty much every image that you see on a website, it's a raster graphic, because you don't really require anything special to view it. So raster graphics is probably the most commonly used of all types of images. Like I said earlier, photographs that you're taken and displayed are also raster graphics as well. Vector graphics are primarily more for the creation of logos and illustrations that are meant to be printed out. And that's because a lot of times you need to print something in many different sizes. You want to print a logo for a small business card, or if you want to print it for something that's going to be on a big billboard, you only need to have that one vector file. And you can create all those different things in different sizes. And they're also pretty small and compact. Since they're just made out of basically equations, it doesn't take up a lot of memory space, so they're very easy to transfer as well. So now I'm going to go ahead and go into a quick little tutorial on how to use Illustrator. Illustrator is probably the #1 program you're going to be using to make vector graphics. The pen tool is probably going to be the most used tool that you're going to be using out of everything else. Now, like I said earlier, when you make lines with the pen tool, those lines are called paths. And you make those paths by plotting down anchor points. And you can modify how your path is going to look by modifying the anchor point. So on image 4, it shows that you plot a dot or an anchor point on A first, and then you plot a second one where B is, and that automatically creates a line between them. Now what if you want to make that line into a curve? Well, you go ahead and you select one of the anchor points, and it shows these little lines expanding out of it, and those are called handles. And you can take one of those handles and you can rotate it around, and that affects how the path is going to curve. So with that, you can basically, it's all coming down to modifying your anchor points. Your anchor points are probably going to be the most important thing when it comes to changing how your image is going to look. Your anchor points control everything. The line and shape tool, those are extremely basic tools that can be used to just make very quick, simple lines and shapes without having to manually do them yourself with anchor points. They're just basically pre-made, they're ready to go, and they even have their own anchor points as well when you make them. So you can even modify them further if you want to. So like say if you want to make a star shape, but you don't want to go through the effort of actually plotting out every individual point to make that shape, you can just use the star shape and it's already done for you. The brush tool, now the brush tool is not a real traditional brush per se like you would in Photoshop. Rather, the brush tool you can basically use to draw a path, and you can do it of various thickness and style with it. Now keep in mind that you're not drawing on a traditional grid of pixels, you're drawing onto basically a graph. So any line that you draw has to be converted into a path with its own anchor points. So you'll notice sometimes if you're using the brush tool and you draw something, you'll notice that it might wiggle a little bit, or it might, the overall shape of it might change a little bit. And that's because it's trying to make anchor points as you make the line. So it may not come out as exactly as how you drew it. So the brush tool can be useful, but it can also be hit or miss at times. It really depends on how good you use it. And you can simulate pressure sensitivity with the brush tool. It does not have it on by default. You actually have to turn it on yourself. You have to go into the brush options and you have to tell it to use pressure sensitivity in order to do it. But it can be done. Live tracing, this is something that was already shown earlier in the class, but I'm going to go into a little more detail on it. Now, live tracing, basically the whole point of it is to take a pre-existing raster graphic and you're going to turn it into a vector graphic. Now, the effectiveness of how this works really depends on how vector ready the image already is. So this one can also be really hit or miss. As stated earlier, since vector graphics are primarily made out of anchor points to create the image, that limits how the colors can be applied. So because of that, when you take a like a photograph for example, like this dog right here, if you were to try and convert it into a vector graphic, there will be loss in color quality when it comes to that. But on the other hand, live tracing is extremely useful if you're trying to turn like a line work drawing into a vector. that's where it's much better. It's much more useful if you use it for that. So for this example, I showed a logo that I did for a Digital 1 last semester. The first image I drew it in Photoshop first. It's a very messy sketch, obviously, but when I took it into Illustrator, I went ahead and I did a live tracing of it, and it came out pretty good. But it's gonna have a little bit of a, it's still gonna be a little messy, so you will have to modify it yourself a little bit more afterwards. But that's the beauty of it, because when you live trace it and you expand it, it gives it its own anchor point, so you can modify it even further afterwards. And I even showed how you can zoom in and it's still perfectly clean. There's no blurriness or anything. Hold on, I'm ready. Oops. But I'm going to go ahead and show you a personal example of how to do these. So I'm going to open up Illustrator so you can actually see how to use these different tools firsthand. Illustrator. Oh yes, that is right. Let me minimize you. Sure. Okay. Alright, so let me go ahead and show you the first tool, the pen tool. This little thing right here. So you just basically plot a dot right there. And you plot another dot, and bam, it instantly makes a line between it already. Or what if I want to go ahead and make it a curve? So like I said earlier, you can modify your anchor points by either using the selection tool or the direct selection tool. But we're going to go ahead and use the direct selection tool. So I select the anchor point. Boop. Maybe it is with this one. Okay. So I can select it, and I can move it around, and the line corresponds with it. Yours different?
You just have to be really precise with where you click, which is why I'll often use a mouse for that. It's annoying with the stylus. You have to hover right over it. Yeah. You're trying to convert it?
I'm trying to curve it.
Yeah, so go to the pin tool options, and you have to have it set on the convert the anchor point tool.
Because usually I don't have to do that, it just does it automatically, but oh well.
There's also hotkeys for it, like Option or Control.
So now I got the handles to come out. So I can take these handles and I can rotate it around, and that will actually affect how the line curves with it. And so you can use that to modify how your lines are going to come out, or your paths, I mean, rather. And then with the line tool, you just can just make just simple lines. Just real quick and easy. And the shape tool, you can have like a rectangle, ellipse, polygon, star, just stuff that you can just make really quick, and it has its own anchor points already, as you can see. So it's just very quick and simple. It's kind of like a little cheat tool. And the brush tool, you can draw your lines instead, rather than plotting out anchor points. But just keep in mind, you'll notice that sometimes it might shift a little bit when you're drawing it out, because it has to put down anchor points for you. So say like I tried to like a really crazy thing, and you notice it kind of changed a little bit. So that's gonna be inevitable, but it still works pretty well. But you can select it, and you'll notice it has its own anchor points already, so you can go and modify it even further if you'd like. And it's not really a way I can show an example of live tracing, but that was pretty much already shown. But live tracing, you can just import it into, like, from Photoshop or JPEG. You can bring it in, and you can choose to trace it, but it doesn't actually take into full effect until you hit the expand button, which actually puts in the anchor points for you. So keep that in mind. That's pretty much the presentation. But before I end it, got some candy for you. But I'm gonna have to make you punks work for it. So I'm gonna do a little quiz, and if you answer these right, then you get a candy for it. It's just 10 questions.